And welcome to the BTAA GIS conference. I'm Cecilia Smith at the University of Chicago, and I'm going to be facilitating this morning's keynote address. We're thrilled to have you here with us, and we're looking forward to an excellent lineup of speakers. First, I would like to share a sincere thank you to the planning committee who's listed here for bringing this all together, and to Nicole Schultz at the University of Michigan who chaired the committee this year. So thank you all for bringing us this great program. We're going to start our day with a keynote address by Dr. Robert Lee. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and while Dr. Lee starts to share his screen, I'm going to share an introduction. Dr. Lee is a historian of the United States focused on Indigenous dispossession and US state formation in the 19th century American West, and has a PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley, an MA in American Studies from Heidelberg University, and a BA in History and Economics from Columbia University. He was a junior fellow at the Harvard Societies of Fellows before coming to the University of Cambridge. Dr. Lee's research focuses on North American colonization, mostly in the 19th century, and he is currently writing a history of US expansion by Indian treaty using an approach that combines archival digging with spatial analysis in GIS. And his talk today is titled American Doomsday. Dr. Lee?
Thank you. Let me start by sharing my screen here. Thank you so much for that introduction. Can you see my presentation now, the American Doomsday here? Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. I want to thank Cecilia and Nicole and the Big Ten Academic Alliance GIS conference organizers for inviting me to speak with you today, and thank all of you for being here as well. I'm really excited to be talking with the GIS group. I'm a historian, and I think unlike a lot of historians, I'm a heavy GIS user. I'd like to see that change. I started learning GIS a decade ago and have depended on GIS librarians for resources and for instruction. So it's really a great honor for me to be able to be here virtually at least and speak with you today. So I study Western lands and the relations between the United States and indigenous nations. And as I inundate you with maps today, it's gonna become obvious that I am especially interested in the potential for GIS to find new entry points into one of the oldest areas in the professional study of American history, that is the disposal of the US public domain. What I'm going to do today is describe some of the possibilities opening up from general land office data. I'm going to put these possibilities in historical context, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about a tool that I've been working on to visualize the legal transformation of roughly 1 billion acres, it's billion with a B, of the American West from the 18th century to the present. The project is called American Doomsday for a reason that will become clear in a few minutes. At the heart of it is land patent data, which I think is enabling us to ask new questions about everything from gender to ethnicity, demography, and more. Perhaps most importantly, I think this kind of data is going to allow us to write new histories that shed light on the legacy of indigenous dispossession in the United States. I should add too that what I'm talking about today is not a finished product. So let me just say that I'm happy to take questions later, but I will be just as grateful to hear your thoughts, your recommendations, your advice, and your comments. I've organized my comments today into 3 rough parts that you see here. First, I'm going to give a quick overview of the public domain and talk about where the doomsday idea comes from. Then I'll go over what makes this project's development possible in terms of sources. Then I'll illustrate, and I do mean that literally, why it might be useful in a way that's meant to be more suggestive than comprehensive. So let me start by saying a few words about the US public domain. The US public domain is the colored portions of the map that you're looking at here. It came into being after the American Revolution and eventually covered 30 present-day states. It started with Western claims by the original 13 states, relinquished to the central government. I could see from the Big Ten map earlier, most of the Big Ten universities are within that sort of old Northwest area. That was the first part of the public domain. Then as the US makes various imperial acquisitions, things like the Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican Cession, the Gadsden Purchase, so on and so forth, those get added on to the public domain, with the exception of Texas, which retained its own public lands and its own disposal system. Now, these were all just paper claims, right? The public domain was Indian country in the 18th century, the 19th century, into the 20th century, parts of it. It was possessed, it was controlled, it was governed by indigenous nations. And over the course of the long 19th century, the United States seizes this land through a variety of means, most prominently by these lopsided treaties backed by and often fronted by violence. Federal authorities then survey the land. You can see the meridians and baselines on this map here. They then privatize many of the parcels, issuing land patents to new owners. The land went to individuals. Some of these are settlers or families who are going to occupy the land. Lots more are speculators who are going to flip the land. The land went to various corporate entities, municipal bodies, state bodies. And the patents that issued them, they're like deeds. They're like federally issued deeds that are issued under the authority of various federal laws. And I'm sure many of you have heard of some of these laws. I mean, like the Homestead Act or the Morrill Act. But there were a lot of these laws. By the 1880s, Congress had passed more than 3,000 public land laws redistributing indigenous land appended to the public domain. This process really revved up after the War of 1812. Then it goes on like gangbusters, really, until the 1930s, when the US shifted more towards a policy of management of public lands versus disposal of public lands. So as a result, most of the 1.2 billion acres patented by the United States were doled out in the 19th and the early 20th centuries through the General Land Office. In this period, the US was one of the largest, if not the largest, producer of private landed property in the world. It was a massive process of redistribution from indigenous nations to settler communities that was central to the colonization of the space we now call the United States. And I should add that it never really stopped. There was this big drop-off in land patenting in the 1930s, but it still continues at a snail's pace today. And my point here is that the disposal of the public domain may seem old-fashioned, but it's also a living history. And it's a huge story that involved patenting millions of land parcels. And when I say millions, I mean somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 13 million parcels. But that's sort of a guess because we actually don't know. Literally no one could tell you for sure how many parcels of real estate the United States created out of the public domain. So how can you even study something so enormous, right? That's the basic question. How can you even study something so enormous? Now, I'm not the first to ask that. And the history of asking that question is where my title, American Doomsday, comes from. In the late 19th century, when property creation from the public domain was just exploding, something else was happening too. Universities in the United States were professionalizing. They were becoming the doctoral granting institutions we know today. In my field, for instance, the American Historical Association is founded in 1884. The first history doctorate in the United States is in 1873. The American Library Association, that's founded in 1876. And among early professional historians, you have some of them who are studying the US, most Europe, but some are studying the US, and they're asking, what are the big questions? And some of them just sort of like look around and they hit on public land disposal, which is happening. And if you look back at what they wrote, they all started talking about federal land records as akin to a Doomsday book, referring to the great 11th century English property survey. one of the most important windows onto life in England in the Middle Ages. This idea appeared in the first major history of the public domain in 1880, which argued that the General Land Office records, quote, constitute the Doomsday Book of the public domain. Others followed, invoking this Doomsday Book idea to gesture at the scope of land patent records, the sort of scope and detail that they had. And no one took that idea more literally and more seriously than Joseph Schaeffer, who is this guy that you see pictured on the left here. Schaeffer was a historian, but he was also a librarian and an archivist. And part of me thinks that if he was living today, he would probably be a GIS librarian. In 1919, he became the superintendent of the Wisconsin State Historical Society, where he launched this ambitious project that he called the Wisconsin Doomsday Book. On the right here is the first page of Schaeffer's proposal, which outlined his idea for, quote, a systematic geosocial survey of the state. He wanted to create an enormous atlas that would, quote, give the student of Wisconsin history immediate access to the names of first settlers in each section of the state, together with an ocular account of the lands they occupied. This atlas was going to map every piece of property patented in Wisconsin and provide information about all of its purchasers. He took the 6x6 square mile township as his organizational unit, and he hoped that the atlas was going to sort of scaffold and scale up local history gleaned from questionnaires and interviews that would be conducted through partnerships with historical societies and schools. He argued that all of this place-specific detail was going to enable us ultimately to point out the influence upon Wisconsin history of even very local and seemingly humble individuals. Now, on its surface, Schaeffer's idea typified historical practice in the early 20th century. He was a disciple of Frederick Jackson Turner, who celebrated pioneers. He was a progressive era historian who wanted to understand how civilizations advanced. He was a devotee of scientific history. He championed what he called the microscopic method to examine the cell life of the American West. But for all of his Turnerian trappings, his progressive spirit, his scientism, Schaeffer's intellectual agenda is not so easily dated or pinned down. He was skeptical of historical objectivity. He noted the limits of archives and their readers. Every researcher, he said, detects in his evidence those things which his mind is prepared to see. He was also concerned that information overload was becoming a problem. In a complaint that feels really as true today as ever, he worried that studies were appearing, quote, at so stupendous a rate that no reader, however voracious, could possibly keep pace. Now, in the face of these challenges, he counted himself among those who advocated interpretive history, and he uses that word, interpretive, which for him meant favoring arguments tied to particular themes over pretensions of universal coverage. But if interpretations were going to account for the actions of thousands of people or even hundreds of thousands of people, how could historians possibly substantiate general claims? How could you do that? The Wisconsin Doomsday Book was going to be his answer. It was going to provide, as he put it, evidential equipment for crafting interpretive history, or at least that was the plan. 4 years later, volume 1 of the Wisconsin Doomsday Book comes out. It contained township maps like this one on the right of Schaeffer's hometown of Muskota, Wisconsin, along with short histories. The volume was beautifully done. It was painstakingly done, but it was also a total failure when measured against Schaeffer's original plan. So here was the problem. Volume 1 covers 23 Wisconsin townships, but there are over 1,300 townships in the state. So at this rate, the project was on track to be finished by the year 2146. That was just too much, and the whole project flamed out. But even in failure, Schaeffer's work made lasting contributions. His microscopic method helped lay the groundwork for the community studies that blossomed in the 1960s and 1970s with the aid of IBM punch cards. As a form of demographic aggregation, Schaeffer's Doomsday idea foreshadowed works like the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the North Atlantic Population Project, these projects which use mass quantification of small units, slave ships, census entries, to trace macroscopic trends across time and space. Digital humanities scholars today, I think, would nod approvingly at his embrace of collaboration and recognize his calls for aid as a kind of proto-crowdsourcing. From a century on, Schaeffer's project appears to have had all the hallmarks, really, and all the hubris of the quantitative methodologies that 20th century historians would grow fond of, then wary of, and then push in new digital directions. From 2021, I'd say it looks like Schaeffer's biggest obstacle was one that he couldn't really foresee. He called for a Doomsday book, but what he really wanted was a Doomsday database. That's what he was trying to make. So it's worth asking, what if you could actually build a Wisconsin Doomsday database that could map land patented in Muskota Township here at any given time, like I've done for the year 1848 when Wisconsin became a state? What if you could combine that information with related data sets like information on county seats or the extent of Indigenous land cessions, something Schaeffer was all too typical of his time in ignoring? That's what you see here. Then you could start to statistically describe some of the deep context of settler colonial property creation on the public domain. Now, what if you could scale that up? And instead of a Wisconsin Doomsday database, you built an American Doomsday database with the date, purchaser, and legal authority behind almost every piece of real estate carved out of the US public domain since the 1780s. Now, the animation you're watching here tracks the spread of over 11 million land patents issued across the public domain year by year, condensed into 2 minutes. Combined with data on Indigenous land cessions and imperial claims, it shows the property conversion process as it unfolded on the public domain. It comes from a geodatabase I've been building that I think, like Schaeffer, could become a useful piece of evidential equipment used to cut across a vast swath of America's past, where the actions of thousands or hundreds of thousands of individuals mattered. But unlike Schaeffer's project, I'm less interested in the distribution of the public domain than its redistribution from Indigenous nations to settlers. This data set makes it possible to see who acquired these 11 million parcels, when and under what legal authorities, but also who that land came from and how it came into US possession. It cross-references land patent data with data on Indigenous cessions, showing how the public domain was formed into reservations and further deconstructed, what imperial claims underlie the United States' rights to the continent under the so-called doctrine of discovery. And finally, it shows what legal tools the United States used to remake this land into settler property. I'm using this resource in my work to think about the relationship between Indigenous land cessions and the growth of the United States. And I think it could become a helpmate for researching a number of other issues. And I think it could point us toward questions that we really haven't even really begun to ask. So that's the what. Now I need to say something about the how. How did I just compress the chronological and spatial distribution of 11 million parcels of public domain land into a 2-minute animation? This isn't meant to be a step-by-step technical talk, but just let me say what's most relevant here is that the GIS tools to work with this data are accessible, as you all well know. Though they may take an obscene number of mouse clicks, result in some excruciating wait times, require some frustrating trial and error. They're accessible, even still. What I really mean by how here is, what are the sources? What are the sources that make this type of work possible? So I mentioned earlier that the distribution of the public domain was this huge piecemeal project, right? But it was also predictably structured because the survey system, the public land survey system, was rectilinear. Here again, on the left is the public domain, which was subdivided into ranges. Each range is subdivided into 6 mile square townships. Each of those townships is subdivided into 36 sections. Each section is 1 square mile. At the point of purchase or grant of these parcels, sections can be further subdivided into about 500 or so different varieties of halves, quarter, or quarter sections, and so on and so forth. The important thing here is that unlike meets and bounds survey system, the location of any of these parcels can be written out and described using a structured string of about 20 to 25 characters. Versions of those public land survey system location descriptions appeared on the patents that were issued for parcels as they were issued, and copies of those documents were kept. Now, anyone who has flown across the United States and just looked out the window has seen the General Land Office's impact on the landscape, right? You look down at the ground, you see all these squares. But its archival history, particularly its recent archival history, is not so widely known. The patent records were originally kept in the Treasury Department until they were folded into the General Land Office, which was created in 1812, which was later replaced or absorbed by the Bureau of Land Management, or the BLM, in 1946. Now, because these are property records with a continuing legal importance, the BLM became a site of perpetual and ongoing research. And in the late 1980s, 30 years ago, that led to the creation of the General Land Office Records Automation Project, which set the goal of scanning the GLO patents and organizing an electronic catalog that contained the land descriptions of each one, along with the date, the patentee, and other key attributes, like the legal authority under which the patents were issued. This would allow individuals to easily search the records and get copies without damaging the originals. And so that's exactly what the BLM has been up to for the last 30 years, creating this resource. This is a pretty boring slide until you realize what is going on here. This on the left is from the BLM's website. It describes the scale of the GLO records automation project. Literally, we're talking about millions of records transcribed since the 1980s. They started migrating the data online in 1998, over 20 years ago. It's all there in zip files, although when you download them, you'll find yourself in a sort of a confusing mass of hundreds of spreadsheets. It's both a nightmare of materials and a dream come true for a historian of public lands. What you're looking at here really is the inadvertent performance of the lion's share of the repetitive and expensive work needed to produce an American Doomsday database. Not a carbon copy of what Schaefer envisioned, but an even more ambitious kind that lay just beyond his field of vision and far beyond the resources, or frankly, the resources of any individual scholar. So this has been online since the late 1990s, and here's the public interface today on the BLM's website. Many of you might know it. So how have historians really failed to take full advantage of this opportunity? And the short answer is that they've been sort of asleep at the wheel, historiographically and methodologically. I'll just illustrate the historiographic side with a quick personal story. When I started my current job at Cambridge, one of my colleagues introduced me by mentioning that my work was picking up topics that he hadn't thought much about since his comprehensive exams. Now, this person went to graduate school in the 1970s, when work by public land historians in the United States was required reading. Now, I'd be shocked to hear a similar introduction from anyone who went to graduate school in, say, the 1990s or later, because by then, the bottom had dropped out of the study of public lands. I mean, broadly speaking, as the study of the American West made its way sort of around the cultural turn in the 1980s, the study of the disposal of public domain land looked terribly old-fashioned. I mean, because it was, and it sort of receded into the background. I'm not against change. I know my work, like everyone else's, comes with opportunity costs of research not pursued. We all know trends and scholarship come and go. What I am saying, though, is that in this case, the timing literally could not have been worse. As one of the most incredible resources for scaling up the study of public lands emerged, it didn't even warrant a shrug from most historians. Awareness of this material is really only now sort of moving into focus. Methodologically, too, historians have been somewhat slow on the uptake. The GIS tools needed to take advantage of this kind of data were, as you all know, commercialized in the 1990s. They've since become quite user-friendly. Historians arrived to the GIS party late. When I started graduate school in 2009, UC Berkeley didn't even have an option for humanities PhDs to obtain a GIS certificate, but things are changing. I stumbled on the GLO data after reading public land studies from the 1960s, and I was wondering, where the heck did this patent data come from? Earlier scholars, it turns out, were transcribing the information themselves, which meant small study areas. Trying to figure out how this data set could be used, what it could mean, is what brought me back to Schaefer's work, helped me see the potential of this material to give an old idea a new lease on life, while driving it towards the big questions of today. None of them, to my mind, more important than understanding how expropriated indigenous homelands funded, subsidized, and otherwise propped up the growth of the United States, making it what it is today. So how do you work with it? Here's the GLO data in ArcGIS. The tabular data lacks shapefiles. There's no corresponding shapefile, so I had to create them from PLSS data sets. The shapefiles can then be joined to the attribute files, just like you would with census data from NHGIS. Then you can do things like what I've done here, which is visualize the real estate frontier on Census Day in 1890, an iconic date associated with the closing of the frontier. But once placed in a GIS, you can then start overlaying and cross-referencing this data with other data sets, opening up new research possibilities. Which brings me to the why. Why would it be useful to build an American Domesday database? I'd love to hear your ideas, but as for me, I see this as a resource to visualize and articulate relationships that have been previously hard to see, to revisit classic questions about the political, social, environmental, and economic history of the American West, and to come up with new ones. Most importantly, what I see is an investigative tool for approaching unwieldy problems associated with isolating trends and patterns drawn out over long time spans and over large spaces and involving thousands or even millions of individuals. But that's all a bit abstract, so let's get concrete and take a look at some maps to get a sense of what is going on here. In addition to looking at patterns across time, you can isolate patterns by various types. Here are the credit sales permitted by the United States until 1820, showing their reach and relative density. They reach as far west as Missouri. I'm just going to cycle through a few more of these examples. Here, by contrast, are the much more extensive cash sales, the largest category in the data set by acreage. A close second there is the nearly 3 million successful homesteads you see here. Contrast this to the voluminous literature on the Homestead Act, and you'll find that by necessity, historians have studied homesteads in relatively small areas, typically a county or two, and garnered a steady stream of yes, but type critiques, as in, yes, this is the case here, but does it hold elsewhere? Drawing results from this source base is slightly less susceptible to those types of criticism. Here are a variety of military patents issued under scrip warrant acts. These were notorious vehicles for speculation, and perhaps they had a reach and significance in the antebellum period that historians have underestimated. Here are allotment patents issued under the Dawes Act, which allotted land to Native Americans. Given the prominence of the Dawes Act in textbook narratives of American history, Frankly, I was surprised to see how few you see here, as well as this cluster in Alabama and Mississippi. This might in part come from gaps in the GLO data, but not completely, because there are a bunch of other laws allotting land in various ways that we generally don't pay as much attention to, giving a much fuller picture of Native American land patenting and reservation patents that appeared in the late 19th and early 20th century. I'd say there's some room here for textbooks to catch up with really the mind-bogglingly complex history of allotment. I mean, now imagine taking data from any of these maps I've just shown you, or the hundreds of other possible examples I haven't, and joining it to other data sets to deepen the analytical reach. For example, we'll be able to identify what indigenous nation each parcel had formerly belonged to, what congressional district, if any, it was located in at the point of sale, what its natural features like soil quality are like. Want to, for example, analyze the land privatization in the Black Hills, which was stolen from the Lakota in the 1870s. With this resource, you can develop a rough picture in a couple of hours, right? Instead of a couple of years. You can identify, or you can measure distance to locations like forts or rivers or county seats or sacred sites, and ask if there are any statistically significant patterns. You can use names from the full count census to find a range of information on thousands of these patentees, and consequently ask questions related to property acquisition, family structure, migration, ethnicity. You can, for instance, search names. You know, I could look for all the Bobbies who received land patents, you know, just because. But you could also do a search for a list of most common German names, you know, like Wilhelm, between 1870 and 1890, and see if that reveals German ethnic settlement clusters that aren't well represented in the literature. You can count multiple parcels linked to a buyer to ask questions about the nature, reach, and extent of land speculation. Really, though, I think some of the most compelling uses for this resource are going to come from enriching the GLO patent data with other data sources. So let me show you a couple more examples just from my own research. So I became interested in mapping land patents while studying territorial Missouri. I was trying to understand the relationship between indigenous dispossession and a land rush to a place called Boone's Lick in central Missouri after the War of 1812. You can see it on the Missouri River here in the central part of the state. Now, using a variety of sources, I reconstructed the population growth of Boone's Lick between 1810 and 1820. So here's the growth curve. And what you can see here is that the settlement just took off in 1815, right after the territory's Indian superintendent issued a proclamation that declared Indian title was extinguished to the land in and around Boone's Lick. That's when newcomers just start flocking into this place in unprecedented numbers. So between 1815 and 1820, the population of this place rockets from about 500 people, 500 settlers, to over 20,000. But what did that mean for the territory of Missouri? So I turned to the patent data to place these figures in space. By integrating the patent data with census counts, I was able to roughly locate population growth on a sub-county level. This is what Missouri's population distribution looked like in 1810, when Boone's Lick was still an Indian country. The larger dots here represent towns, the smaller ones represent households. And this is what the non-Indigenous inhabitants of the Missouri Territory looked like in 1820. So you notice the change, right? This is not a population that appears in the central part of Missouri. That was the Boone's Lick land rush. And if we measure the difference in settlement density over the decade, we get this, a heat map that calculates the increase in rural settler households per square mile. So this red and yellow splotch in the center is what it looked like for a place to go from none of the settler population of the Missouri Territory in 1810 to nearly a third of that population in 1820. And being able to measure growth in this way is useful because it enabled me to explain why the growth of Boone's Lick, which I imagine, unless you're from around there, you probably haven't heard of, why it played an important role in American history on the sort of national stage. Unbeknownst to historians, Boone's Lick was the fastest growing place in the United States between 1810 and 1820. Its growth was atypically large, it was unpredictably intense, and it provided the essential boost that brought Missouri statehood within reach by 1818, all of which made it a demographic event with really national consequences. Without the growth of Boone's Lick, Missouri would not have been able to mount a credible petition for statehood when it did, which means that without the erasure of Indian title that triggered this land rush, the series of events that led to the Missouri crisis over the expansion of slavery in 1820 would have taken a different course. And the really interesting thing about that finding is that while historians have written books and articles about the Missouri crisis for over a century, they've never really considered indigenous dispossession as a contingent factor in the coming of the Missouri crisis. Now let's try something a little bit more speculative. One of the things I was really interested in as I put patent data into a GIS was sex and gender. Land patenting is popularly coded as a male-dominated activity. I mean, just look at the cover image of Patricia Limerick's Legacy of Conquest. I don't know what types of hats those are, but there's a sea of them there, right, that you can see. But how male-dominated was it? And did that mix vary over time and place? There's no data on sex in the GLO corpus, but there is a good way to predict from information that is there, namely first names. So using first names from the 1880 full count census, which codes for sex, I was able to assign the patentees a predicted sex based on their names, and use that to turn out these results. A heat map showing the sex ratio of patentees by place. And it turns out that women were much more prominent as recipients of patents as the 19th century wore on than the literature suggests. Of course, there were exceptions. Utah in the 1890s is as male dominated as Ohio in the 1810s. But there are also hotspots of higher levels of female involvement in land patenting. And I haven't really even begun to unpack what's going on here. So I just want to point your attention to one interesting feature, and that's this. Almost all of the hottest hotspots for female land patenting correspond with current or former Indian reservations, which I imagine has something to do with the structure of the allotment process, right? That historians don't really fully appreciate or haven't fully integrated into the stories that they tell, right? I'll just give you a final example because I see I'm running long on time. I know I'm here today because the organizers heard about my work on land grab universities, a project with High Country News that mapped 99% of the 10.8 million acres of indigenous land redistributed through the Morrill Act of 1862 to land grant colleges in order to build up their endowments. What they didn't know is that the American Doomsday project made the land grab universities report possible. Land grab universities was in part a proof of concept for American Doomsday, an effort really to show that emerging methods in historical GIS could be applied to land patent records to write new histories of the redistribution of the public domain that shine a spotlight on legacies of indigenous dispossession. So this is an early map from those efforts, showing data from the American Doomsday database, which contains between 80 and 90% of the parcels distributed through the Morrill Act. The challenge really of the Land Grab Universities project was to go beyond the data set, this data set, right? To use this material as a springboard into archival research that could be further integrated to create a complete picture of the legacy of the Morrill Act. So the result was landgrabu.org, a website which the video here is touring along with an article and database, which provides an unprecedented look at the wealth transfer from indigenous nations to land grant universities that was enabled by the Morrill Act. Land grab universities exposes how, contrary to popular belief, the Morrill Act didn't just give free land to universities. The act redistributed nearly 11 million acres for more than 250 tribal nations for the benefit of 52 colleges. And the website here visualizes this footprint, which included more than 80,000 or nearly 80,000 parcels scattered across 24 states. So here you're looking at Cornell's land grant. Over 2 years, we investigated those parcels in order to better understand the relationship between higher education and US colonialism. The website lets you explore all of that data. You can locate yourself on the map. You can check addresses to see if it's on a parcel or what Indigenous land session it's on. You can see the massive reach over the country of these university land grants. There's just a ton of information to play with on this site, and it shows what's possible when using the American Domesday data set as a base to launch a targeted research project like this. It starts you off and it gives you a head start. If you haven't had a chance yet, I'd urge you to take a look. Visit landgrabu.org, check out the data, see if your institution is in there, think about what you might do with it with students, and imagine what other projects might be developed from a larger land patent GIS mapping tool. And I hope you do, because that's exactly what I'm developing. So here's the interface of the American Doomsday mapping tool that I've been working on. It enables users to sort of mix, match, and parse the data. Here you see land patents under the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. For each of these parcels, the tool identifies the legal pathways the land patent took from being indigenous homelands to private property. This particular parcel that's been selected was Northern Paiute and Washoe territory. Here's a close-up. This parcel is 640 acres. It was claimed by the United States via the Mexican cession, ceded to the United States by the Paiute in 1874. It was patented in Story County in what was then, at the time it was patented, the state of Nevada, to the Central Pacific Railroad Corporation on February 11th, 1904. Do you want to see all the patents issued in Colorado territory from land ceded by the Cheyenne and Arapaho after the Sand Creek massacre? I mean, this tool can enable you to see that quickly and easily. Want to see the subset of those in which women were listed on the patent? You know, this tool has it. Want to see the subset of those that were issued in the year 1875? You can see that too. My intention here isn't to be exhaustive. It's to be suggestive and I hope provocative. So to come to a close here, an American Doomsday database will enable you to make maps like this one. But what I see is more, what I see here is more than a pretty precise picture. I see Schaefer's big idea amplified and retooled for the benefit of new generation. I see a massive federally funded archival transcription project that would be foolish not to take advantage of. I see a chance to revisit old questions and ask new ones. In short, I see an opportunity to rewrite the history of the public domain from the ground up using GIS tools. But as I said at the beginning, this is a work in progress, so I'd really like to hear what you see too. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bobby. That was a wonderful talk, an incredible database that you've assembled there. I mean, this is a really, I think, an exciting application of geospatial techniques to some data that has been around for a while. So I think this is just wonderful. If you have questions, feel free to write them in the chat, or if you want to use the raise hand feature, you can do that as well.
Comments and suggestions are also very welcome.
So we have some kudos in the chat. I see a hand raise here, Squires.
Bobby, I just retired from the University of Minnesota. I've been looking for someone like you for the last 25 years. Most of my research has to take place on the rectangular land surveys. And so I was familiar with most of the stuff you talked about. I've been fascinated. I've used some of the GIS stuff in a couple of court cases that I was involved in. I'm not a GIS expert, but I'll correspond with you. I want to talk with you and pick your brains and fill in some gaps that you might have, perhaps.
Yeah, if anyone has some questions or wants to correspond afterwards, my email was on the first slide, but it's also on my faculty page, so you can find it easily. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a question in the chat. Do you see any possibilities of using this database for explaining why significant portions of Western US are still publicly owned lands, which remain a contentious political subject in the Western US?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we need this database necessarily to provide an answer to that question. This is a policy change that happens during the Great Depression. You have things like the Taylor Grazing Act, which is passed in 1934, and you have a shift to holding on to the public. So the public domain remains in federal hands until it is privatized in some way. So everything that was left by the 1930s, for the most part, that is held onto. There are small pockets of land patenting that continues to go on. There's a boomlet after World War II in the sale and auctioning of these patents. I mean, this is still going on today, but for the most part, the federal government then sort of holds on to what it has and moves into a mode that is directed towards conservation. And that's all types of conservation, from allowing grazing to creating extending the Forest Service. This shift happens in the 1930s when the amount of land that is being privatized just craters.
So I'll jump in with a question. So you obviously brought together a lot of data. Could you talk about the comprehensiveness of the data, or if there were any, surprises and quirks along the way as you, did processing and cleaning and bringing it all together?
I mean, this is one of the major challenges, and the answer is the BLM tells you that its digitized data is incomplete and that they don't know how incomplete it is. So the only way to figure this was one of the problems that we were trying to solve in the Land Grab University's project. So we could see that a lot of the Morrill Act parcels were in BLM data, but how do you know if you have them all? I mean, you can start to analyze it, and you could see that there were big empty spaces. There were some states that were just completely absent, and there wasn't a lot of rhyme or reason to it. So the challenge was to figure out how much is there. And so what we had to do, so it's like you can't just work with the digital methods alone. You have to combine them with archival methods and with broad reviews of the secondary literature. So we had to figure out how much each one of those individual grants was, see how much we had from the digital data, and then see how much we had to figure out through boots on the ground type archival research in Washington and other places. And what we found there, and sort of generally speaking, this data set covers roughly about 80% of the land that was privatized by the United States from the 1780s to today. This was about the proportion that we saw in the Land Grab University's project, but it's also, I mean, you can just sort of, you can do a back of the envelope calculation by taking a report of how much public land there is today, subtracting that from the amount of acreage that's in the United States, and then seeing how many acres you have covered here, and then seeing what the difference is. So you can get a rough picture that way. And I think it's in like the high 70s or around 80% of the coverage. So it's not complete. But the big problem is it's not incomplete in an even way. It's uneven in what's missing. And so what you can do with this data is you can drill in to a more specific question or more specific project, and you can get a big head start. But you wouldn't want to stop with this material alone. You would want to combine it with other material. So what I'm trying to put together is a sort of a resource for scholarship in this area, where people could use this to sort of as a springboard, as a helpmate to figure out where to go in the archive and what they have here and what they need to gain a sort of a big picture or a view from 30,000 feet of a particular land distribution problem.
Okay, so we have a request for a recommendation for introductory book on the history of public lands for getting started with this kind of work.
Yeah, I see Paul Wallace Gates is he is the dean of public lands history. He wrote a book on Cornell's land grant. He wrote this book that was dropped into the chat, which is actually a federally funded project. The first big history of the public domain was a federally funded history in 1880. Paul Wallace Gates writes the follow-up, which is still the standard. It's a standard history of public land law and public land policy. This massive book, I have it somewhere here on my desk actually. Public land policy by Paul Wallace Gates. He has a huge corpus of works, which is the place where I would tell any student to start looking at this history.
We have time for one more question if there's any. Okay, well, thank you again, Bobby. This was fascinating. I'm really excited to dig in and start playing with those data sets. This was wonderful. Let's see, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right, so here's our schedule for the rest of the day. We break next, which is a great opportunity to check out the map gallery that we have up. And that's going to be followed by concurrent sessions. So we have flora and fauna and the built environment beginning at 10:20 Central Time and 11:20 Eastern Time. And I hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone.
So much for having me.